Welcome to this week's edition of Freedom and Prosperity Radio, the weekly radio news magazine brought to you each week by the Virginia Institute for Public Policy. My name is Joe Thomas. Happy Labor Day weekend to you, and enjoy perhaps a little extra time or labor more than usual and make some extra cash. It's up to you. Our first guest this week, director of the CATO Institute Center for Educational Freedom, back on the program, Neal McCluskey. Welcome back, Neal. How are you doing, sir?
Oh, I'm fine. Thanks for having me.
Well, and I want to jump right in, because this is one of those subjects that has been unfortunately baffling to me for the 15 years I've been here in Virginia, and even before that. School choice. Real money follows the child school choice programs have eluded us in Virginia for some time, even though statistically over and over again you see states and cities where it's done, and there have been great successes both for the schools and for the parents that choose to go other options. It's become a campaign issue in Virginia. Gubernatorial and lieutenant gubernatorial candidates have come out in support of it. What is it about real educational freedom has eluded us in Virginia, in your opinion, Neal?
Well, a lot of things stand in the way of school choice in Virginia, and Virginia's not all that different from many other states. The good news is Virginia does have a private school choice program. A lot of people don't know about it, and sort of getting the word out would be certainly beneficial. But the state has had a scholarship tax credit program for a while. Now, it can be a little confusing. Basically, if an individual taxpayer, or I believe a corporation, if they want to donate money to a group that gives scholarships, they can get a state tax credit, a 65% state tax credit. And so that's been there for a while, but it's tiny. It's $25 million, which may seem like a lot, but that equals about 0.35% of what the state spends on education. So it's there, but it's tiny. And if you want to include local and federal money, it's even smaller. It's about 0.15% of what is spent otherwise. So you've got this, but the question is, why so small? Why doesn't school choice just blow up and people simply demand, I should have a choice? Money that would be spent on my kids in public schools should follow them to whatever school I choose. Part of it is most people are familiar with public schools. Mm-hmm. That's where they went. We all have to pay for public schools, so they are, they appear to be free, at least from the user's perspective. And they think, well, that's just kind of how things have always been done, and it probably works out pretty well. But what we've seen, especially over the last, year and a half under COVID, not just in Virginia, although Virginia's been a bit of a poster child for this in some places, but across the country, is people saying, wait a minute, this actually doesn't make sense. Even if I'm in a district that gets good test scores and I like the teachers, what I've discovered is you can only deliver education really one way. So if I need in-person education for my child, but someone else needs online, especially under COVID, only one's going to typically get what they want. And so we have a lot more people demanding a lot more school choice across the country. We've had about 20 states create new or expand school choice programs in the last 6 months or so. Virginia's not quite there yet, but we see these battles in Loudoun County and Fairfax County and elsewhere, and maybe we'll start to see more demand for school choice in Virginia, too.
Well, I was told when we did the scholarship program, and I talked to school choice advocates, several things wrong with it, such as you have to be approved by the state to qualify to use it, to tap into it. It's not, on you. You have to file, you have to apply, you have to meet standards, and then the state determines whether you get to tap into it. So many of those things. But one of the most dispiriting things I was told by somebody who watches this stuff a lot is that the conservative voices, usually the place you find the most vocal advocacy for school choice, would then claim that they did school choice, pat themselves on the back, and never revisit the issue ever again. And true to their prognostication, this is the first time it's really come up since then, because I was told twice, I can quote members of the General Assembly say, no, we did school choice. We did it already. We've already done that. Talk about, Neal, the places where it has been done and it has been done successfully, so that, again, we remind the listeners that this isn't some fanciful flight of, Greco-Roman imagining. This is actually being done in cities in the United States.
Yeah, it's being done in cities and states. The states that are sort of the top ones to look at are clearly Florida and Arizona. It seems like almost every year they expand their school choice programs. Florida, I think, maybe does actually do it every year. And and it's not just private school choice, although that's, I think, the best, because private schools have so much freedom to do what they think is right. But you see in Arizona and Florida that they are not only expanding private school choice programs, but they have charter schools, they have choice of public schools. So within districts, and you go to another district, they believe that choice is central. And if you look at a place like Arizona, where most education is really chosen, again, not all private school choice, which I think is ideal, but they spend much less per pupil than most other states and get much better test scores. If there's one thing that is clear in research on school choice, it's that the more competition public schools face, the better those public schools do. 26 out of 28 studies that looked at the competitive effects of school choice on public schools found it makes public schools do better. And so Virginia should really look at what's happening in Florida, what's happening in Arizona. Pennsylvania also has really embraced school choice, although they haven't expanded as much recently. But you can also look at states that didn't used to have school choice, in particular Kentucky and West Virginia. Just this year passed brand new school choice programs. Why? Because COVID has made it so clear to so many people, even the ones who thought they were in good school districts before, that people have got to have choice, because even in a school district, families are diverse, kids are diverse. Some have different health problems, health challenges, different levels of tolerance of risk. Some need in-person education. Some do well online. And it's just become crystal clear to everybody, or to many more people, that you've got to have school choice to accommodate diverse people. And then another part of it is teachers' unions have stood in the way, especially last year, stood in the way of in-person schooling. And a lot of people said, I don't want to have to negotiate with a union to get what my child needs. And so that's also fueled school choice.
Neal McCluskey is the director of the CATO Institute Center for Educational Freedom, and we're talking about educational freedom. I'm glad you brought up the Arizona, case study where they actually have seen per student expenditures go down, because once you put that marketplace out there, Virginia, I think, averages $11,000 per student per year. There are places like Charlottesville where it goes up towards $15,000 per student per year in educational expenditures there, and obviously some of that is physical planned and things like that. But I'm just saying that when you break up their budget by the number of students, it doesn't pencil out. And this puts the pressure on the school division to say, well, do we need to spend $15,000 and then make that sort of money available to a parent that might take it off for a private school somewhere?
Yeah, the reality is when you look at the data on spending, there's very little correlation between spending and outcomes. Now, part of this is because we don't actually even agree on what the outcome should be. So for a very long time, top-down control of schooling has meant, well, we got to improve test scores on standardized tests. And a lot of people say that is not what education should be. That's incredibly limiting and not very good. Now, that doesn't mean that spending doesn't make some difference. There is a level of spending you need, but we don't see a lot of powerful evidence that every time you increase spending, you get better outcomes. And what this Arizona data shows, and what all those studies on the competitive effects of school choice show, is when you put in the incentives where schools have to perform better in order to hold on to their students. And holding on to their students, even for public schools, can matter for money. Usually at least state money follows a student to some extent. At least if the child leaves, the district no longer gets the money. Well, that is totally changing incentive structure. If you need to satisfy families in order to get your money, you will have an incentive to work harder and more efficiently. But one of the problems we have with expanding school choice is that people, they like the idea of school choice. But when it is pushed, the unions, administrator associations, other groups that, have a vested interest in education, and a lot of people who don't, study this full time, there are not many people who do that. But regular people will hear from those groups, wait, if there's school choice, money will leave our school district,
right,
and that'll hurt us because we won't have as much money. And what they don't realize is that actually when the money follows a student, there's more left over in public schools. So if you spend $10,000 per student and only $5,000 follows a child to a private school, which is typically roughly how it works, that's more per student in that child still in the public schools. That may well be another reason that public schools do better as they face more competition. They can focus more resources on those students who are still there.
He's the author of a book called School Choice Myths as well, a co-editor along with Corey DeAngelis. But again, I would suggest you get the book because this stuff will come up. It's a campaign issue this year. It's probably going to be, especially as we come out of COVID-19, where parents try to figure it out. And many of them discovered, hey, I can do this. And I've coined a phrase, Neal, and please step aside in case lightning strikes me, but I call it the underground school bus. I've seen statistics that say pre-COVID, 3% of black families homeschooled. That number is now 16%. It's actually the highest percentage of any population cell in the homeschool world. This says to me, especially the communities of color that we're told by our friends from the left that we should be caring about, they're seeing benefit to this. We had Paul Lott on this program a couple of weeks ago, and he said, what's one of the problems in the black community? Property values drive educational failure, and so schools and property values kind of get tied at the hip. These are things that if a real social reformer would be looking at, this is what you should be doing.
Yeah, so the first thing I'd say is you got to take some of that homeschooling data with a grain of salt. Certainly there was a big increase in homeschooling last school year. There's always a question about how a question is phrased. The Census Bureau was saying that they saw a big increase from roughly 3% of people homeschooling 2 years ago to 11 or so percent in the last school year. But it's not always clear, and their question certainly wasn't clear. Were people saying, yes, I am now taking charge of my child's education and delivering it myself at home, or are they receiving education from a formal school? It could be a public school, it could be a private school, and it's being delivered in the home because it's online. We've also seen for this upcoming school year a decrease in homeschooling from those highs. So I just want people to understand that it may not be as high as we think. That said, we've seen actually increases in African Americans in particular homeschooling, but lots of people homeschooling, not because of COVID, but because they simply aren't satisfied with what the schools are delivering, and they often feel like the schools are marginalizing them. So African Americans were saying, look, I don't see my family and my child reflected in much of the history that they learn. As you know, things like how much African American history you teach in a regular survey history course, whether or not you allow ethnic studies. These are very controversial issues in public schools, and often what that means is nobody really ends up getting what they want. And certainly African Americans who want those things have often found that they're just not available in their public school. And they say, the way I'm going to get these is I'm going to take charge of my child's education myself. And so we've absolutely seen more and more African American families saying, I'm going to homeschool. Just as we saw in the past, more and more religious families saying, I'm going to homeschool because a public school cannot teach devotional religion. And what we should learn from the sort of battles we're having over things like critical race theory, which Loudoun County, Virginia, is sort of like the poster district for the country for these things, is we have diverse people with diverse views, and we shouldn't have an education system that basically makes them fight to decide who wins and who loses, who gets the education they think is right for their child, and conversely, who gets something imposed on their child that they think is abhorrent, or who doesn't get what they think is essential. That's why school choice even more than funding and all these other things, is really absolutely crucial. Free, independent people should have the ability to decide what it is they think is important to learn or not important to learn or dangerous to learn. It shouldn't be imposed by government.
Neal, you mentioned earlier that teachers unions tend to be some of the strongest opponents of school choice. Yet in an abstract, when I've looked at economics, the more competition there is, the better it is for the producer of that product. All right, in this case, product is education. Wouldn't more competition mean more competition for the best teachers, therefore more impetus for the teachers to have the best outcomes and therefore perhaps higher wages?
Yes. And so this is something that, again, I think in part because almost everybody is accustomed to public schooling. They think, well, the way you deliver school is the government runs a school district and you're in it and that's how you get education. And that's probably teachers as well. And they don't realize, well, what that really sets up if you're a teacher or an administrator or any other employee is you are now working with a monopoly. And when you have to work with a monopoly, the monopoly has all the power. Mm-hmm. Because it's hard for you to go anywhere else. And that means the monopoly can keep your wages low. And that is almost certainly what most teachers are facing, that if there were competition, one of the ways that schools would compete is to get the best employees, to reward employees, to incentivize employees to do well. And that often means not just higher pay, but often many teachers say they hate bureaucracy and they hate being told exactly what to do and having to fill out forms. Well, they're less of that if the way a school is held accountable is that people take their money to it or away from it, as opposed to, well, the state tells you what to do, and then the district tells you what to do, and then you got to fill out paperwork for them, and oh, by the way, the federal government gives you money, so they demand paperwork. That's how top-down accountability has to work, and it's awful. It is incredibly inefficient, and nobody likes it. And so teachers should want school choice, but again, we have a problem that most teachers are in teaching to teach because they love teaching. Right. And they don't want to be involved in education politics and policy all the time. And often what happens is unions and other people try to scare them. They say, well, if you have school choice, you're going to lose all your job protections and you're not going to get paid any money and it's going to be terrible for you. And they tend to then oppose school choice, I think often out of fear, just as most members, many members of the public do.
Isn't it Jefferson in the preamble of the Declaration of Independence, understood that people will suffer the familiar rather than look for substantive change. But at the end of the day, I think it's a win-win for everybody. You mentioned a couple of states that do this. Have you gotten a sense? I know in Virginia, I've used the phrase, we have the grandfather of all Blaine amendments, which are usually used by states to say, can't do school choice because of separation of church and state. We, of course, have the founding father of all of them, the Virginia Act for Religious Freedom. But I think the message of money following the child has changed that paradigm. Do you sense the same thing?
Well, yeah, not only has it changed the paradigm, and you don't hear separation church and state as much to oppose school choice, although you certainly do still hear it. But there's now a very long line of of Supreme Court precedents that say there is no wall of separation of church and state the way we often hear that no money could even indirectly go from government via a family to a religious school. In 2002, in Zellman v. Simmons-Harris, the Supreme Court said it certainly isn't a violation of the federal Constitution for money to follow state or children to religious schools as long as the parents choose it. In fact, what government is supposed to be regarding religion is neutral, neither favoring it nor disfavoring it. And within education, the only way to be neutral is to let people decide where they want their child educated. Right now, what public schooling does is it treats religious people as second-class citizens. It says you can get this secular public education, public schooling. But if you want religious education, you're going to have to pay twice. And so starting with Zillman v. Simmons-Harris, and then if you go to the much more recent Espinoza case, which said in Montana you cannot exclude religious schools from school choice programs because that's discrimination against religion. We have slowly but surely sort of swept Blaine amendments away. They still exist. They can still hold on to some extent. But there's another case that's going to the Supreme Court called Carson v. Macon, which is in Maine, where they have something called town tuitioning, where if you're in a town that's not large enough to support a high school, you can take the money to a private school, but they said you can't take it to a religious school that acts on its religion, which is weird. So you can take it to a religious school, but it can't be for religious use. You can't you learn religion there. And that's now being challenged, and that could be yet another bit of Blaine amendments gone. And, of course, Virginia does have a school choice program, and a lot of people don't know about it. But that means they have found a way to bypass what may be a Blaine amendment, because not only in that case, not only do parents choose, but donors can choose whether or not they want to donate. That is true freedom, and freedom means equality under the law.
And I think our kids need to see this in the classroom borne out as well, Neal. So next 12 months, maybe 24 months, what do you see coming about either in Virginia or other states regarding school choice in the United States?
Yeah, that is a good question. And a lot of this is going to depend on how mask mandates end up working and what happens with COVID, because clearly a lot of the impetus for the major increase in school choice over the last year was people very unhappy with school districts, typically that said, we know that your child will do better with in-person education, but we just can't provide it. It's not an option here, and that's too bad, but that's how it goes. A lot of people said, well, that's not acceptable, and so they demanded school choice. One estimate, actually, is that currently there are about 600,000 kids in a private school choice program nationwide. The expectation is in a year or so that'll be up to 2.4 million kids. Wow. That is a big increase. I think in the case of Virginia, you will probably continue to see people upset over mask mandates. And maybe if some schools have to go into quarantine, they'll have to go back to online schooling, which many people found unacceptable. But I think these conflicts over things like critical race theory are probably even higher profile in Virginia. And my hope is that many more people will realize you can still debate these. These are issues that should be debated, but the debate shouldn't be based on what will be imposed or withheld from my child. Yeah. And I'm hoping that will lead to interest in school choice, but Democrats are in power in Virginia, and they tend to not like school choice. So there may have to be a political change in Virginia for school choice to really take off.
Well, and you'd love to be able to have, a moment with somebody and have that moment of clarity where it becomes irrelevant what your political party is if you really do believe. And we run our school board candidates apolitically. You don't declare as a Republican for school board or a Democrat for school board. So you would like to think that would, quote, vaccinate the process, pun intended. Neal McCluskey is the director of the CATO Institute Center for Educational Freedom. School choice myths, great for these moments, Labor Day barbecue where somebody's like, oh, you just want to keep all our money away from the poor kids. That's what and you can kind of debunk a lot of this stuff because it's out there and they will ramp up the machine. That's how you'll know educational choice is getting close. You'll start to see the ads during the Super Bowl. Luckily, nobody's watching that anymore. Neal, you have a wonderful day. Cato.org is the website, and have an amazing rest of the weekend.
You too. Thank you very much.
Coming up next, election integrity with one of the professors from our election university that we held a couple of weeks ago, our Election Integrity Summit, which I believe you can now view much of it online at virginiainstitute.org. Dr. Clarabelle Wheeler, former member of the State Board of Elections, will join us on Freedom and Prosperity Radio next.